Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to session 3 of our course, What History Class Left Out, African History from 10,000 BCE to 711 CE. We have a lot to discuss today, a lot of details, a lot of history, and we're going to, again, maintain our focus on the Nile Valley. So today we'll be talking about ancient Egypt as well as Nubia. We will continue with Nubia next week, but we're going to get started with Nubia today because there's a lot of overlap between these civilizations, not only geographically, but also culturally and socially and those types of things, politically. So that's what we're going to get into today. So a lot of information. Make sure you're taking notes. As always, make sure that you are using our course website to follow up with all the readings and videos so that you can get a deeper understanding of the ideas that we're talking about. If you're following along in the recommended book, The History of Africa by Kevin Shillington, we are still in chapter 2. All this material is coming out of chapter 2 of this textbook. A little bit of chapter 3, but primarily chapter 2. And if you are reading the UNESCO book, we are in chapter 4 of that book, and that is broken down on the course website. So you can follow directly along on that site because that book is free. This book you would have to purchase. All right, so let's get right into it because we got a lot to discuss. We'll break in the middle and then we'll pick up. So again, keep all your questions that you have, write them down. You can ask them when we get to our first Q&A, or you can type them in the chat and they'll be addressed in our first Q&A, or you can wait to the end and ask your questions as well. All right, so today we are talking about Nubia. We're talking about Egypt in the middle and the New Kingdom. So we're talking about a good chunk of history that we're going to try to run through in an hour and 15 minutes. We'll see how successful we are at doing that. So let's situate ourselves geographically. Again, we're talking about the northeast corner of Africa, and we are talking about Egypt and Nubia. Again, today, I have to remind everybody I'm going to be using multiple names for Nubia. Sometimes you'll see it as Nubia, sometimes you'll see it like on this map as Kush, and sometimes it's referred to as Ethiopia. But what we're essentially talking about is modern-day Sudan, the northern part of modern-day Sudan. And when we talk about Egypt, I'll be using Egypt and Kemet interchangeably. Egypt and Kemet. Egypt is the Greek word for the kingdom, and Kemet is the name that the people themselves called their place, as well as Tameri, and these names means the two lands, all of that. So I'll use Kemet and Egypt interchangeably in this lecture, and I'll use Kush, Nubia, and Ethiopia interchangeably in this lecture as well. But this is what we are talking about today. So we finished off last week talking about the Old Kingdom. We talked about proto-dynastic period, or the period before the Old Kingdom, before Egypt was united. We talked about the unification of Egypt and what some of the highlights of the Old Kingdom in terms of the first female pharaoh. We talked about the first pharaoh. We discussed the great building projects of the Old Kingdom, the pyramid, the step pyramids, the great pyramids at Giza. We talked about Imhotep, the multi-genius that worked on the step pyramid. And we talked about the decline of the Old Kingdom, going into the first intermediary period, the period where you had chaos reigning in Egypt, where there was no central government. We talked about how rulers from the south, from the city of Waset or Thebes, emerged and started the 11th dynasty under Mentuhotep. Mentuhotep came, conquered, reunified Egypt, and this gives birth to the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is what we'll be talking about today. Starts with the 11th dynasty around 2000 BCE. So if we look at, again, this world comparisons, what was going on in other places in the world at the time, We are right about here, the Middle Kingdom. This is around the time the Middle Kingdom was happening. China has its first dynasty. Actually, China's first dynasty starts earlier than that, during the Old Kingdom, actually. Uh, but then we have the Vedas written, ancient Hindu texts written around this time. And again, Greece is still a good almost 1,000 years before Greece is really doing anything. So just keep that in mind as we talk about these things. We're already in the Middle Kingdom, so we're going to be discussing this period of Egyptian history, from the Middle Kingdom down to the 25th dynasty today. All right. One of the aspects of the Middle Kingdom that is really important for us as historians and really significant for us as we study the history of ancient Egypt, we get much more information, much more written information about the lives of everyday people. The Old Kingdom, where writing is established in Egypt, much of the writing is dealing with the royalty and administrative issues in terms of business and royal business. And the people that we learn about are the royals themselves, or people that worked for the royal family, writing about how much of a joy it was to work for the royal family. We talked about some of those autobiographies that existed on people's tombs. You know, today when we bury people, there's a space limit. So you might get a headstone that says, "Here lies so and so, he was a father and a son," or she was a mother and a daughter, and she lived from 1930 to 2024 or whatever. Back then, on people's tombs, if you could afford it, they wrote their entire autobiographies. And really, they were like LinkedIn pages, as I mentioned before. I worked here, I worked for the Pharaoh, I loved working for the Pharaoh, I really enjoyed working for the Pharaoh in this position, blah, 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 blah. I worked for the government here, 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 and there. So we had that. If you hear any noise in the background, that's fine. What we're having is there's a community fair. No, maybe fair is not the best word. A community market here on Montreal Road, African Caribbean Community Market. So if you got time today, come out. It lasts until 6 o'clock. So that's what you hear if you're hearing that music in the background. All right, everyday people. So and is it coming through a lot? We can keep going. Okay, it's good. Okay, so they can't hear. All right. One of the findings that we have with the Middle Kingdom, one of the things that really makes the Middle Kingdom significant is the amount of writing that we have. The Old Kingdom is known for its monuments. You know, we mentioned them, the pyramid, the Sphinx, all those things. The Middle Kingdom is a period of great literature. And again, going back to everyday people, we get the thoughts of everyday people in the literature and the stories of everyday people. And when I say everyday people, I don't want this to be confused. The literacy rate in ancient Egypt was still relatively low. I mean, very low, as it was most places in the ancient world. Where probably only around, at the most, 5% of the population could read and write. And that's not saying that the population was stupid or ignorant. It just means that that's what the literacy rate was. Writing was a highly specialized skill that took training, and most people didn't need to be trained in writing to do what they needed to do, to be farmers, to be coppersmiths, to be bakers, to be whatever it is that they were. Most people didn't need to know how to read and write, so most people didn't learn how to read and write. But if for the government in an administrative position, or you were a scribe, you learned to read and write. But that was a small portion of the population. It's a big population, so it's a lot of people. But comparatively speaking, probably 3 to 5% of the population could read or write. But those that could read or write, they wrote about their lives, their feelings, not just about what they did for the government. They wrote fictional stories. They wrote religious texts. They wrote mathematical texts, people that dealt with those types of sciences. They wrote medicinal texts, text on surgery, text on cures for diseases. They wrote these things out. And I want to stress that a lot, because although we have all of these texts and these materials, again, only a small portion of the population could actually read and write. It's just like today. not in terms of reading and writing, but we use all this technology around us, but there's only a small portion of the population that can actually code and program and do computer programming and do coding. Even though it's so pervasive in our lives, most of us can't code. Most of us can't read that language and do those things to program computers. I think it's probably less than 1% of the world's population can actually do that, but it's so pervasive in our lives. So think of it like that. Think of writing and what they were doing in ancient Egypt as a type of coding, where, yeah, you're using it and you're doing these things, but most of us can't do it. Most of us can't do it. That's the equivalent that we can make today. But so what do we have? We got things like the Dialogue of Impuwar and the Lord of All. And this is a text that was written around 1900 BCE. And it's really interesting because it talks about what was going on in the first intermediate period. It talks about how things were upside down from the perspective of the wealthy folks. And I love what is written here. It says, lo, offices were open, the records stolen. Woe is me for the grief of this time. Lo, the scribes of the land register, their books are destroyed. The grain of Egypt is, I go get it, or it's up for grabs. Anybody could just go grab the grain. Lo, the laws of the chamber are thrown out. Men walk on them in the streets. Beggars tear them up in the alleys. So there's no laws, lawless. It says, he who had nothing is now a man of wealth. The nobleman sings his praise. See, the poor of the land has become rich, and the man of property is a pauper. So during the intermediate period, when you have less political control, from the perspective of the powerful and the wealthy, this is a calamity. Now you got poor people with money, things are upside down, nobody's respecting the laws. But if we flip this and we look at it from the perspective of the everyday Egyptian who was a farmer or who was a baker or who was a stonemason or whatever, that first intermediate period might not have been a bad period for them. The taxation was probably less because there was nobody, really strong enough to collect the taxes in some of these nomes and provinces in ancient Egypt. So it might have been a pretty good time for the everyday person. That was until the kingdom was reunified under Menhotep II. And when he did that, then he initiated a more centralized government. Prior to the Middle Kingdom, in the Old Kingdom, the regional governors were pretty much left to their own devices as long as the taxes got to the pharaoh. In the Middle Kingdom, in order to maintain control, the pharaoh appointed the regional governors and the local rulers. So you had to answer the pharaoh directly, which meant that more concrete control over the population was established, which turned things back in the favor of the rich and the powerful. That's the balance that they're looking for in society. So very interesting. When we look at writing in ancient Egypt, and this is also important for us as we study history, understand that the writing took various forms between the old Egyptian and the Coptic that would emerge, almost 3,000 years later. And it's important for us to recognize this because depending on the period of Egypt you're studying, Middle Egyptian, Late Egyptian, words are going to be structured differently, things are going to sound differently, and that's like any other language, just like English. Think about what English sounded like in 400 up to 1,000. We talk about Old English and Middle English, and then Modern English emerges in 1500. So you have to keep that in mind when you're studying ancient Egyptian. You have to know what time period that it was written in. So you'll know how to pronounce things or the closest approximation we have to pronouncing things because there's no vowels in ancient Egypt. So you got to kind of play around with it. But you have to know where you're at to know what's being said in the text. So it's just another important thing to point out. Languages change. It's like populations change and evolve, so do languages. All right. Another great text that emerges in this Middle Kingdom period was the Book of Hunanpu, which talks about, although there is social inequality in Egypt, you do have the rich and the powerful and you have everyday people, it doesn't mean that the rich and the powerful can just take complete advantage of everyday people. That was against the principles of the nation. That's not to say it never happened, but the nation's primary principle is ma'at, is order, is balance, is reciprocity, it's these things, it's righteousness. So although you might have a better station in life than somebody else, and you might have more material things in them, you're not supposed to hyper exploit them. You can exploit their labor, of course, but not hyper exploit them. And this book is one about hyper-exploitation and how it is against the principles of ancient Egypt. It's a book about and one of the English translations of this title was The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant. The tale of the eloquent peasant. So essentially in this book, you got Hunahpu. Hunahpu was a regular working class guy. He has a farm. He's going into the big city to sell some of his goods so he can make money for his family. On his way, he encounters a rich man, and he has to pass the rich man's property. And the rich man is so greedy that he sees this poor peasant, this poor working class farmer coming with his goods, that in addition to all the things that he has, he also wants this peasant's possessions. So he sets up a barrier on his property that that Hunahpu and his donkey can't get past without trampling the man's crops or without going in the water. So he sets up this barrier. Of course, as Hunahpu is making his way, his donkey starts eating the man's crops and stomping on him. So the man gets furious. He beats Hunahpu. He takes all his goods and he leaves him destitute in the big city. Hunahpu then goes to the local official and he starts complaining about what this rich man did to him. And he is really good with his speech. He's really eloquent. He can talk about how this was an affront to righteousness and to Ma'at and to justice. And as the local official, you need to make sure that Ma'at is upheld, that righteousness is upheld. And he goes into these long diatribes. And the local official is so impressed by what Hunahpu says that he writes to the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh says, don't make a judgment on this man yet. Have him keep coming back and giving these eloquent speeches on Ma'at so we can hear what he says. So Hunahpu comes back day after day to the local official, and he's making his appeal. And as he makes these appeals, they get more and more inflammatory, where he starts not just appealing to the general principle of Ma'at, he starts personally attacking the official as someone that's not upholding Ma'at. And it's a very brilliantly written diss track. If we talk about modern parlance, we talk about rappers dissing each other. This was a brilliant use of words and how he attacked this man's character and this man's aptitude as an official. And eventually at the end, the Pharaoh says, all right, give this man 10 times what he came with, punish the rich man that attacked him, and all's well that ends well. And it ends beautifully. But essentially, it's a tale of the rule of law. It's saying that everyone is equal under the rule of law. There's certain things that you cannot do to people, no matter what their station is in life. You can't be that greedy to take the little that this man has. And if you do that, you have violated the principles of Ma'at, the principles of righteousness and justice. So this book, elucidates that. Now, again, these are principles. These are the high principles of the society. That doesn't mean that everybody in ancient Egypt was living a Ma'atic life. Just like today, we got the Bible, we got the Quran, we got all these books and things about how to live righteously, and we see what our world looks like today. Ancient Egypt was no different. People are people. This is just a reminder to people that this is how you should act. And it was a reminder that was written somewhere between 1985 and 1773 BCE. BCE. They're talking about these ideas of the rule of law and human rights and these types of things thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt. So very beautifully written text. Again, it emerges in this Middle Kingdom period. You have another Ipuwer, a different one. And this one is really personal. And it deals with a man contemplating suicide. And he writes this beautiful text. It's a dialogue between a man and his soul. It's a dialogue between his man and his soul. And this is one of the texts you can find in the book that I love to talk about in this class. It's called Intellectual Traditions of Pre-Colonial Africa. Intellectual Traditions of Pre-Colonial Africa by Constance B. Hilliard. This book is a collection of written documents that go from Egypt to Nigeria to South Africa to the Congo, all dealing with important essays and fictional accounts and histories in Africa before colonization. Very important book. And this is one of the texts that's collected in this book. And it's really interesting because, in today's modern times, we talk a lot about mental health and we think that, the ancient times, since it wasn't talked about, I guess everybody was mentally healthy. And that's probably the furthest thing from the truth. we know people go through things and they have internal battles with themselves. And this man wrote it. He talked about what was going on in his mind and making the decision that he ultimately didn't make. He doesn't kill himself, but he's thinking about it. He's thinking about my life is not going well. I should just end it. And he's talking to his soul. And he says, I opened my mouth to my soul that I might answer what it had said. And he said, this is too much for me today, that my soul no longer talks with me. It is really too great to be exaggerated. It is like it has abandoned me. Let not my soul go away. It should wait for me, because there is no competent person who deserts on the day of misfortune. Behold, my soul wrongs me, but I do not listen to it, dragging myself toward death before I come to it, and casting myself upon the fire to burn myself up. May it be near to me on this day of misfortune, and wait on that side. My soul is stupid to try to win over one wretched over life, and delay me from death before I come to it. But again, he doesn't end up killing himself, but you see this back and forth that he has with his own inner self. It's a beautifully written text. I'm going a little bit fast because there's a lot to talk about today. Another complete book that we have from, again, almost 4,000 years ago. We have the Maxims of Ptah-hotep, a book of instructions written from father to son, which a lot of these books, these wisdom books, were written at the time. This is part of the great wisdom literature of the ancient world. You see this in Proverbs, you see this in books coming out of Greece and Babylon and different places. They were texts that tried to teach people how to live and how to do right in the world. And it's very practical advice, even in 2024, a lot of the things. I just picked a few. It starts, the Vizier Ptah-hotep, so it's a government official, a high government official, not a royal person, but someone that's akin to Secretary of State. It might be the best position to compare it to teach the ignorant about knowledge and about the principles of good conduct, things that are profitable to him who will listen, but a source of sorrow to him who disregards them. Thus he spoke to his son Ptah-hotep the younger. Do not be haughty because of your knowledge, but take counsel with the unlearned man as well as with the learned. For no one has ever attained perfection of competence, and there is no craftsman who has acquired full mastery. Good advice is rarer than emeralds, but yet it may be found even among the women at the grindstones. So don't be haughty in your knowledge. If you are a man of trust, one who sits in the counsel of his Lord, direct your attention toward excellence. Your silence will be more profitable than babbling. So speak only when you know what you're qualified to do. This is 4,000-year-old advice. 4,000-year-old advice. How many people sit in meetings at work with coworkers that just babble on and on and on and on? You're like, don't talk unless you got something to actually say. Constructive. You're just holding up the meeting. This wasn't advice they was given over a Zoom meeting. This is 4,000 years ago, and it fits right in 2024. Last one I love. If you're wealthy after having been destitute and have amassed riches after poverty in a town where people know about you, do not boast of what has come to you in the past, and do not be too confident in your possessions, which have come to you as gifts of the God. Again, very important. If you come into some money, don't be flashing around people and trying to, big time people. Just be humble with it, because just as quickly as you got it, you can lose it. Very 4,000-year-old advice. These are the types of things that are found in the papyri of ancient Egypt when archaeologists find works such as the Maxims of Ptah-hotep, things that are written in stone, things that are written on pottery shards. We'll talk about that in a minute. It shows you that in ancient times, it's not like we're dealing with a different species of human being. They're just like us. They might not have all the technological advances. They may not have all the experience that we've accumulated over thousands of years. But at the end of the day, when you think about ancient Egypt or Nubia or Ghana or Nigeria or anywhere else in the world, understand we're dealing with people that would react to the same things, the same phenomena the way that you would react. They're people, the good, the bad, and everything in between. I love pointing that out. All right, so the Middle Kingdom, again, a great time of the everyday man, and then the ruling class is holding things down. The Nile is flooding regularly until we get to the end of the Middle Kingdom, and again, everything comes to an end. So around 1500, around, really 1000 BCE. So this is a time period that lasts roughly, if we go back and look at our chart, it lasts about 700 years. We could say about 700. Actually, no, excuse me, I'm looking at the wrong one. About 400 years, 400 years, we get this Middle Kingdom period. And it starts to go to an end with a number of things start to happen. Environmental things, of course. Again, the pharaoh and the ruling class is responsible to make sure that there's ma'at in the land, not only in the justice department, but also in the environmental department. So if the Nile doesn't flood the way it needs to flood and there's famine, that stuff gets blamed on the royal family. And people start to lose faith in the power of the pharaoh. And that leads to divisions, and it leads to intrigue, and it leads to military coups and all types of things on a local level and then on a national level. And in addition to that, you also have two invasions. And we're going to put invasions in quotation marks. We'll talk about why in a second. But to the northeast of Egypt, coming from the Levant, Syria, Palestine region, you have a group of people known as the Hyksos that start making their way into the Nile Delta region. So into Lower Egypt or Northern Egypt. Remember, Lower Egypt is the north, Upper Egypt is the south. So we're talking about Lower Egypt. We have this group that starts to gradually migrate into the Niger Delta, Eastern Niger Delta, called the Hyksos. We'll talk about them more in a minute. To the south, you have Nubia. We're going to talk about Nubia now, but Nubia is also challenging Egypt during its time of internal turmoil. Let's talk about Nubia before we talk about the Hyksos. We talk about these two civilizations together. We're going to talk about Nubia now, and we could have talked about Nubia a couple of weeks ago because their civilizations are so intertwined, going all the way back, even as far back as 5000 BCE, 7000 BCE. Between 7000 BCE and 3000 BCE, what we could tell from archaeology, these two civilizations were pretty much identical. Same types of pottery, same types of social organization up this period. It's after this we start to see some differentiation. Let me go to a map so you can kind of see what I'm talking about geographically, then I'll go back. So now we're moving further south. We're moving up the Nile into Nubia, also called Kush, also called Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a Greek name, and it means the burnt-faced people. And it's not a derogatory term. It's just describing that these people were darker than other folks. So when they talk about Ethiopia in ancient times, they're not talking about the modern state of Ethiopia. So I want you to understand, it's kind of like the Ghana thing that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Ancient Ghana is not where modern Ghana is. Ancient Ethiopia is not where modern Ethiopia is. We're talking about Sudan when we talk about Ethiopia. So Kush, Nubia, that's Ethiopia. Nubia is directly south of Egypt, and the traditional border is the first cataract. The first cataract of the Nile River. It's almost like a kind of like an area where the river goes over big rocks, waterfall type thing. It's a natural barrier. That has traditionally been the barrier between Egypt and Nubia, the first cataract of the Nile River. So between 7000 and 3000 BCE, when Egypt was a lot wetter than it is now, not a lot of difference. By the time we get to around 3000 BCE, we start to see the differences between Egypt to the north and Nubia in the south emerge. And what are those differences? One, Egypt was more based on agriculture. By the time we get to the first dynasties in Egypt, animal herding is present, but it's not a major thing in Egypt. In Nubia, you have a lot more herding of animals because there's a lot more grass in Nubia. When you get back in the ancient times, when you get past the first cataract into Nubia, you start to see more grasslands. The Nubians aren't as dependent on the Nile River as the Egyptians. For the Egyptians, they have desert on both sides of the Nile. And their green space are those areas that get touched by the Nile River on both banks of the Nile. Not the same thing in Nubia. A lot more grassland in Nubia, a lot more space to move around. They're not stuck right on the banks of the Nile River. So they're able to herd animals, and the people are semi-nomadic. They're semi-nomadic. They're not stuck in a permanent settlement the same way that the Egyptians are. This is going to change later on. We know what Sudan looks like today. They didn't always look like that. It was a lot more greener, particularly back then. So that's one of the major differences. Another, Egypt developed writing a lot earlier. And again, this goes back to its geographic location and the types of activities that were going on in Egypt. Because you had this emergence of these local governments that turned into a united kingdom, and the administration needed to control so many people and so many resources, writing was developed in ancient Egypt a lot earlier than Nubia. In Nubia, because the people were semi-nomadic and they were herders, they relied on an oral culture because there wasn't a strong centralized government. Again, another one of the differences between Nubia and Kemet in the early time period. Egypt was highly centralized, particularly by the time we get to the Middle Kingdom, where you got the pharaoh, you got governors, and it's a strongly centralized government. Nubia, less centralized. Yeah, there were kings and there were queens, but they couldn't control their populations the way that the Egyptians could. In Egypt, there's not a lot of land to move around on, so there's nowhere you're going to go. You're going to listen to the government, or you're going to suffer. In Nubia, not necessarily the same. You don't want to listen to the king, you could just take your herd and go over there. And the king's not going to chase for what? Like, this is a different type of reality. You have more space to move. You're less dependent on the government for irrigation projects, which they needed in ancient Egypt. Because of the flooding of the Nile, if you had a farm on the Nile River, the government maintained, the local government and the national government maintained irrigation projects to make sure that the water got to where it needed to go to, feed your crops and all of that. Nubia, they don't have that worry. So if you don't like the government, you could just move on. You don't have to listen to the government. Very important. Nubia was incredibly rich in mineral wealth. A lot of gold in Nubia. There were trees at the time in Nubia. You know, the Sahara Desert has advanced today in Sudan, so it's not as green as it was, but there were trees. There's iron ore, which is going to be exploited later on. There were animals those skins were used as luxury items, leopard skins and those types of things. Much more material wealth in Nubia than in Egypt. Egypt had the agricultural wealth. Egypt was a breadbasket, but in terms of fine things like gold and copper, and all that stuff was in Nubia. So the Egyptians valued controlling Nubia, because if you could control Nubia, you could control luxury items, which the pharaohs loved. We've seen what the burials look like. They loved gold. They loved all of these things. So if you could control Nubia, you could control luxury items. Both civilizations buried their dead, except Egypt or Kemet mummified their dead. There was no mummification in Nubia in early times. This is going to change later on when particularly lower Nubia, when the Egyptians really assert their control over Nubia. But for the most part, people were buried in Nubia without mummification. Mummification was something that was done in Egypt. There's similarities. During the Middle and New Kingdoms, they shared a lot of religious similarities. They worshiped pretty much the same God. Similar in architecture at times, pretty much later times, we see more. Actually, in Nubia, there are more pyramids than there are in Egypt. There are more pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt. They're smaller, but they're much more widespread. So, how do we know about Nubia? We learned a great deal about Nubia, particularly with the construction of the Aswan Dam, which has submerged the first cataract. So the first cataract is not what it was in ancient times, because a dam was built in the 20th century. When that dam was being constructed, a lot of archaeological research was done during that time to make sure that when we build this dam and everything gets submerged under Lake Nasser, that we're not losing too much. So a lot of archaeological research was done before that dam was constructed, and with that, a lot of information about Nubia emerged, and a lot of information about Egypt itself actually emerged. So the archaeological record. In addition to archaeology, we also have the written record. Of course, the Egyptians wrote a ton about Nubia. So in the Meta Necha, in the ancient hieroglyphics, we learn a lot about what was going on in Nubia but it's from the perspective of the Egyptians, which is very important because the Egyptians were a hyper nationalistic people. They were they loved Egypt way more than they loved every other place. To the west were the Libyans. They didn't have any love for the Libyans. To the east were the Asiatics. They didn't have any love for the Asiatics. And to the south were the Nubians, and they had a love-hate relationship with the Nubians. So Egypt saw itself as Egypt first. So when they write about Nubia, oftentimes it's from the perspective of superiority, and it's from the perspective, depending on if they're fighting or if they're cooperating. So you always have to take that into account when you read Egyptian narratives of Nubia. So both in Meta Netia and in Demotic, so the later written Egyptian language, the Greeks wrote about Nubia, again, which they called Ethiopia. The Greeks called Nubia Ethiopia. They wrote about Nubia. The Romans wrote about Nubia, Ethiopia. The Hebrews write a lot about Nubia. Ethiopia turns up in the Bible a lot of times. Anytime you read about the word Ethiopia in the Bible, again, they're not talking about modern day Ethiopia. They're talking about Nubia. So when it says, and princes shall come out of Egypt and Ethiopia shall stretch forth their hands unto the Lord, the scripture that was often quoted, particularly in African political movements in the 19th and early 20th century, when they talk about Ethiopia stretching forth their hands unto the Lord, they're talking about Sudan, talking about Nubia. The people in modern day Ethiopia that come out of the Aksumite Empire, which we'll talk about in week 5 or week 6, they wrote about Nubia to the north in Ge'ez. And of course, the Nubians eventually do develop writing, and they wrote about themselves in the Meroitic script. I do need to correct something that I said in week 1 that's not completely accurate. This script has been deciphered in that we know what the symbols mean phonetically, but we don't know what the words mean, if that makes sense. So we don't have a Rosetta Stone that says, let's say a word is pronounced ka-la-da. We know that this symbol phonetically means ka-la-da. You put these symbols together, they mean ka-la-da. But we don't know what ka-la-da means. So it's deciphered in that you can read it, you can make the noises, but we don't know what those words mean in any way. That's the work that still needs to be done on the Meroitic script, and that work is being done constantly. So when that comes out, then we'll get to understand more how the Nubians saw themselves and how they view their neighbors, like Egypt, like Greece, like Aksum to the south. We'll have a much broader understanding of African history once we finally get to translate that. So maybe that's the better way to say it. It has been deciphered, but not translated. It's been deciphered, but not translated, the Meroitic script. In terms of the modern day people doing this work of reconstructing the history of Nubia, you have Dr. Mahmoud Saliman Bashir, who is head of the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums in Sudan. And right now, Sudan is going through a very brutal civil war. There's a lot of warfare going on in Sudan, so I'm not sure and how that's affecting the state of archaeological research. And that's always an issue in modern Africa. And a lot of times the work that needs to be done in places like Mali and Niger, Sudan, Nigeria, it gets interrupted by political turmoil, economic turmoil, and those things. So I'm not sure what's going on archaeologically in Sudan right now, because that's not the major concern. The major concern is the civil war. But essentially, when things do calm down, this is the work. And he's one of the people leading the work, reconstructing this, and there's so much more to be found. So much more to be found. You have to think, archaeology in Egypt to the north has been going on since the 19th century and still isn't through. We haven't got to the point where people are, wiping their hands and say, we found everything in Egypt. There's still more being discovered every day. And that's been going on since the 19th century. Sudan, the archaeology is relatively newer than Egypt. So there's a lot to be discovered, a lot of history to be written. That's why we do this class every year, because there's more things that are found that rewrite what we know. When we talk about the Hyksos a little bit later, we're going to correct a lot of the things that people have been saying for decades, just because they keep repeating the same thing without reading current research. But we'll get to that in a minute. All right. Also, in terms of someone from the diaspora doing this work, you have Anthony Browder, who works not so much in Sudan, he works in Egypt, but his area of focus is the 25th dynasty, when the Nubians actually took over Egypt for a while. And he studies that time period, and he actually does so through archaeological work. And he brings people from the diaspora, or I'm not sure if he's still doing it, to help with this archaeological work, which is very, very important. Because most of the archaeological work being done in Egypt is being done by non-African people. When you read the reports and you read all the studies, and there's some amazing work that's being done, and all these new scientific techniques being used to reconstruct African history, most of the people doing that are Polish, Ukrainian, Italians, folks from the UK, and the rest of in Germany, but not a lot of folks from Africa that are doing this type of work. And we need it. We need it. We can't keep relying on others to reconstruct our history. And for the most part, these people are doing a good job, and they're intellectually honest, so there's nothing wrong with their work, but we need to be in on it. We need to be in on it. And we need to tell our children that, hey, this is something that you can actually do. That's probably one of the reasons why. We know how we talk to our kids about the 4 jobs that you can do as a Black person. You could be an engineer, a lawyer, or a doctor. And those are the big 3. If you're an engineer, lawyer, or a doctor, you made it in the Black world. And your kid comes to you and says, I want to be an archaeologist. It's like, oh, wait a minute. I don't know about all this archaeology stuff. Or I want to do osteological work. As a doctor? No, I want to do the story. Let's focus on being a doctor. That's what we tell our kids. There's a lot more we can do with our genius to help reconstruct our history. And I know there's a reason for why we do the things we do. We're trying to survive. We want to make sure our kids have the best life. But there are opportunities to go to schools. Most of them are in Europe. Some of them are in the U.S., where you can learn these skills and we can, reconstruct our own history. But anyway, and another person that actually works with Tony Browder is Dr. Nzinga Gaffin, my mentor at Cheney University. She does a lot of this work as well, deciphering hieroglyphics, doing work on the 25th dynasty in Egypt as well. A new book, if you want to really get in depth on ancient Nubia, the Oxford Handbook of Ancient Nubia. It's a collected, edited text. And again, most of the names that are writing on Nubia are Europeans. They're the people that are doing the work. And we need to get in on that. But again, it's a good text to look at. As you see, these are some of the pyramids and the monuments that exist in ancient Nubia. And you can kind of see it a little bit. See the grass in the foreground of this picture. This whole area used to be grass. That's until the Sahara advanced and we have climate change and different things. But Sudan was a lot greener than Egypt. So you could do a lot. The economy was a lot more diverse. You could do animal husbandry and different things. So just, again, aerial examples of the types of pyramids that you'll see in Sudan, in Nubia, that, again, there's more of these there than there actually are in Egypt. All right. From the Egyptian perspective, when we talk about Nubia, Nubia was referred to as Ta Seti. Ta meaning land, Seti meaning bow. So the land of the bow. The Egyptians saw the Nubians primarily for their military prowess as archers. Oftentimes, the Egyptians would use, or different officials in Egypt would use Nubians as mercenaries because of their proficiency with bows and arrows. They were also called the pupil smiters later on by the Arabs. When they came into Africa and had to tussle with the Nubians, they were called the pupil smiters because they could be hundreds of yards away, shoot an arrow, and they could hit you in the pupil of your eye. That's how accurate they were. So maybe if we had a Nubian in Pennsylvania, no, never mind. I'm not even good. That's not, that's that's it. All right. So anyway, the important thing about Nubia is where it's situated and the importance of getting that Meroitic script translated, and so that we can learn about what was going on in other parts of Africa, because Nubia was incredibly connected. It sat right at the edge of the Sahel, meaning this grassland that extends all the way from the Red Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. So all the way from Sudan through Chad, Niger, Mali, Senegal, that entire region where so much African history took place, Nubia is at the eastern terminus of that trade, because it was trade going south to north, of course, but there's also trade going east to west. So when we translate that script, we're going to know what was going on in Chad at the time, what was going on in Niger at the time, and the relations that the Nubians had going this way as well. So it's really important for us to get that translated. So really important place. It's a crossroads area of Africa. Just some Egyptian representations of Nubians. You see them with their arrows. You see what they look like, so on and so forth. The first capital of Nubia. So history of Nubia is divided into its capitals, where the administrative capital of Nubia were. And now we're going to call it Kush, because that's, in this period, the Egyptians called it Kush. Kush means gold. So in addition to being called Tasseti, the land of the bow, Kush also refers to the fact that this place, there was a lot of gold coming from it. So the first capital of Kerma, it flourished during the second intermediate period of Kemet. Here's the rule of thumb when it comes to the relationship between Egypt and Nubia. When Egypt was strong and they were internally unified and the Nile was flooding the way it needed to flood and there was surplus and Egypt was a strong world power, they would control Lower Nubia. They would push their way into Lower Nubia so they could have access to the valuable wealth of Nubia. When Egypt was weak internally, or they were under foreign domination, which we'll talk about soon, Nubia was able to not only wrest control of its northern border, but also could control parts of southern Egypt as well, or upper Egypt as well. So when Egypt was weak, Nubia was strong and able to take over parts of Egypt. When Egypt was strong, it was strong enough to take over parts of Nubia. So that's always the back and forth between these two civilizations. During the second intermediate period, it's believed that the Nubians allied themselves with the invading Asiatics known as the Hyksos, or the foreign rulers. Hyksos is the Egyptian term meaning foreign rulers. So at some point, you get these folks that come from Western Asia that take over the the Nile River Delta in the north, and they ally themselves with the Nubians in the south. So Egypt is kind of in this pincher position. They're getting it from the south, they're getting it from the northeast. And they're incredibly weak internally. This is the second intermediate period. So Nubia is strong. During the New Kingdom, when Egypt got its stuff together, they took over part of Nubia. And when they took over part of Nubia, they brought in Nubian youth, the royalty of Nubia, to be essentially hostages in Egypt. This is a practice that was done by numerous African kingdoms. When you take over a place, you take the children of the kings that you took over in order to culturalize them in your culture, as well as to say, as long as you pay the taxes, your kids will be fine. We're not going to treat them bad. They're going to live in palaces. They're going to learn the Egyptian language. They're going to engage in our religious ceremonies. But the minute that you act up, just understand that your child is here. So this is something that we see this later on in African history as well. With Mali and Songhai, same type of thing. It's also during this period that we start to see the cultures intertwine. Both Nubia and Egypt, the god Amun becomes the major deity. The god Amun or Amun-Ra becomes the major deity as well. In Nubia, Nubians are trading ivory, they're trading incense, oils, cattle, leopard, ostrich eggs, feathers, panther skins, giraffe tail, fly whisk. These are all luxury items. Greyhounds, baboons, all of this is coming from Nubia, because these things can't be found in Egypt. There's no baboons in Egypt. There's no elephants walking around in Egypt. So they need these things from Nubia, and Nubia is providing them to Egypt. And that's why Egypt wants to control Nubia. So very rich, wealthy place. And again, the Nubians themselves, the everyday people, are engaged in all types of activities. They are farming, they're herding animals, they're craftsmen and craftswomen, they're engaged in politics, but we don't know as much about their everyday life because we don't have the written record translated yet. Once we do, we'll find out more about what they're doing. So again, just graphically, this is what was going on during the Second Intermediate Period. You had Kush expanding itself further north, and what you see in the yellow, the dark yellow, this is the dynasty of the Hyksos. We're going to take a break, and then we'll talk about who these people were, their effect on Egypt, and what happened to get them out to establish the new kingdom. So before we move into that, let me stop for a minute and open up for any questions that folks may have so far. Daniel, anything in the chat?
Yes, there are a few questions in the chat, so I'll just ask them one by one.
Okay.
The first question says the dialogue of Ipuwer sounds like a poem. Is it cataloged as such?
They're written poetically, and it depends on which one. Yeah, but they definitely have a rhythmic flow to them, so they could be categorized as poems. Definitely. It's kind of hard to put them in a particular box, but yeah, let me put a marker on that and give you a better answer next week, and I'll actually confer with people that study literature to see how they are categorized, and I'll get back to it. But yeah, there's definitely poetic flow to it. Give me another one from the chat, then I'll go to Mr. Francis, then I'll go to Robin, and we'll go back to the chat.
Okay. The next question says, having no vowels in a word sounds like a strange concept. Is there any evidence suggesting words are pronounced differently depending on context or conjugation?
Possibly. I mean, we don't have direct evidence about how any of these things were actually pronounced. We can just use approximations with Coptic, which is still spoke. So that's an Egyptian language that develops later on. So you can kind of figure out what's going on. There's comparative language studies, which looks at other Afro-Asiatic languages and kind of see what it is. So there's debate about how words are pronounced, but it's really not as difficult as one may think to have a language, a written language without vowels. So of course, the spoken language will have vowels, but when it's written, the people will probably understand what's being said. And it's not as hard as you would think, because Ramesses, the word still kind of flows the way it needs to flow. So it's not that difficult, but linguists are able to discern and make pretty strong, educated, I wouldn't say guesses, but educated approximations as to what it would be based off of comparing it to Coptic, based on comparing it to other Afro-Asiatic languages. They can kind of get it, and even Bantu languages. I've seen some linguists take ancient Egyptian language and compare it to things that are coming out of Central Africa as well, because and there's a whole science behind that I'm not qualified to speak on, but I know that it's been done. All right, Mr. Francis, and then Robin, and then we'll go back into the chat. And Mr. Francis, if you're talking, you're on mute. I'm not sure. We can't hear from Mr. Francis as of yet. So let me go to Robin, and then we'll go back to Mr. Francis.
There's two questions, which I think are pretty straightforward. Mining, like things like the mining they were doing of things like iron, gold back in BCE, like just trying to get a sense of what that was, how they were doing that. Actually, have the massive machines we have now to get how they're actually getting us out of the ground. And then I am fascinated by the concept of trading in things like leopards and giraffes. How did they actually transport the leopards in a cage? The giraffes though, how do they transport giraffes for trade?
I mean, the ancients were incredibly ingenious in terms of what they were able to do. But yes, there was a live animal trade even back then. Capturing these animals, putting them on boats, Egypt loved animals. We're going to get into, when we talk about the New Kingdom, the evidence that they're getting baboons as far away from as Somalia or Eritrea, and they're getting them live, and they're using them in religious ceremonies. So they're able to do these things. Later on in Africa, we're going to talk about them sending giraffes to China. So yeah, they were able to do this. How? I don't know. I don't know all of the ins and outs. I hope those people were paid quite well because I know that you're trying to get a giraffe
Or a
lot-
leopard or a baboon in a
leopard
cage.
in a cage and then transporting it. But they were able to do so. And there were zoos in ancient Egypt that for the royal family. And a lot of these animals represented different aspects of divinities. So they were very important in that way. So we see mummified baboons, mummified leopards, and different things that were used in religious ceremonies as well. Mining. So Egypt, the mining wasn't as extensive, unless we're talking about limestone and those things that were used for those building materials. Some copper in Egypt, a lot of the copper coming from Nubia. But yeah, they just had to hand dig. So it wasn't a lot of like the underground mining, but more so that open pit mining that you see is pretty much what you had going on. So actually, yeah, people digging and getting those things there. When we talk more about we'll talk about Nubia again next week. We really get extensive iron ore mining later on in Nubian history, which we'll get into next week. Mr. Francis, are you back there?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, now, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Good morning. What is the relationship today between Egypt and the people who were known as Kush?
Interesting. So Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia currently, in terms of the governments, I can speak on the governments. Now, what's going on with the actual people, I'm not sure. I can't speak on it directly, but I know at least the governments, they have to interact with each other. Those three, actually four, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Egypt, because they all share the Nile River. And there's been a strong fear that somebody is going to mess it up, whether it's the Ethiopians, they want to build a dam, and the Egyptians and the Sudanese are afraid that, hey, if you build a dam, it might upset the flow of the river and it might cause problems for us. So they always have to negotiate, and all their negotiations are around this river because they all share it. And even though they're not as reliant on it as they were back then, it's still incredibly important for the economies of those nations. And in addition, you have security concerns. There's always spillover in terms of things that happen in Sudan that affect Ethiopia and affect Egypt. So security concerns, the politics of the Nile River, those are always on the table. But in terms of the actual relationships of the people on the ground with each other, I'm not 100% sure on what's going on that level.
Thank you.
Although you do have this whole cultural alienation that has occurred in Sudan and in Egypt, where you have folks that have really clung to the Arab element of their identity, whether they have it genetically or not. And coming along with that is a strong anti-African, anti-Black sentiment. We see it in Sudan. We see it in parts of Egypt. That's not everybody, but it's a lot of folks. And that has been detrimental to relations, particularly in Sudan. Go ahead. And then we'll go, I'm going to go into the room here with Brother Prince, and then Daniel, let me know what else is in the chat. Then we'll continue. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Levitt, you mentioned that the Egyptians had a high degree of nationalism and also that they felt some level of superiority. Can you just expand a little bit as to why they felt that way?
Oh, they're just just the arrogant people. I mean, and this is not something that is limited to the Egyptians. The Chinese call themselves the people of heaven. The Zulu are the people of heaven. Everybody thinks they're the chosen people. In West Africa, when we talk about the Yoruba, Ile Ife is considered to them, this is where creation started. So everybody thinks that the universe revolves around them. So when they get the power to exercise that, then that's what they do. They show themselves that we are the blessed people, we're the chosen land, and and it's propaganda also as well for the ruling families, because if you're the chosen land and you're the ruling family, then you're the best family on earth, and you deserve to rule. So it shows itself in the art. It shows itself in the iconography, and if you present yourself as that, then you can justify why you can control places outside of your land. Like when we talk about in the New Kingdom, when Egypt starts to control Western Asia, parts of Western Asia, as well as into Nubia, that's the propaganda that they use. So yeah, there's strongly us versus them type of mentality, and it really starts to show in this New Kingdom when Egypt becomes imperialistic. It really starts to show. Yeah, but that's not unique to Egypt. That's that's everywhere. I mean, yeah. Anytime, particularly when countries become imperialistic, they start to view themselves like that, and that us versus them. Daniel, what else is in the chat?
There are two more questions. The next one says, are there many texts from the same period in history where people are talking to their souls? Was talking to one's soul considered a common practice?
I don't know how common it was, to be honest. These internal dialogues, I don't know how much we had from other places where people having this. So I don't know that particular answer to that. I'd have to look it up to see if there are other places where, but first off, during this time, you don't have a lot of writing other places anyway. That was written in around, you know, 1800 BCE, 1900 BCE. Only other places in the world that are writing are Samaria and a couple other places. So writing itself isn't that prevalent at that time. So I would have to look into what they were doing in Sumerian texts, if anyone are having these internal dialogues, or maybe even in China, if they're having these internal dialogues as well. But a lot of the writing most of the writing everywhere in the world, whether it's Africa, Asia, is administrative, right? It's really boring writing. Most of it is just, we collected this much taxes today. This is how much taxes are owned. It's really, really boring, but needed for the administration of these kingdoms. So most writing, like 80% of the writing, is just that. It's just really boring stuff, or wills, or estate lists and things like that. So I'd have to look that up to answer that question. And what's the last one? And then we'll move back into the lecture.
The last question says, predicting the weather accurately is difficult today as a science. Is there any evidence of the alchemic or other magical methods used in ancient times to predict weather?
Weather, I'm not sure of. The only thing that I know that they had in terms of a tool to predict anything was the Nilometer. It wasn't even really a predictor. Well, kind of, if you looked at it in terms of a longitudinal study. But this was it's like a ruler that they put on the Nile River to measure how the level of the flooding. So year after year, you can see, okay, this year it flooded to this level, and then it's going down, then maybe it went up, maybe it went back down. But then if it kept going down, 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 or it stayed on a low level, you can kind of see a pattern emerging, and you can start to make plans. We need to save more food because it looks like it might be one of those periods where it's not going to flood as much. So they had the Nilometer. Other weather predicting things, I'm not really sure of that they had. Yeah, not really sure. Because for them, rainfall wasn't really that important because, I mean, Egypt is a desert, so they're not getting that much rainfall. What's important is that flooding of the Nile. That's the weather issue that they're worried about because they're not getting a whole lot of storms and that type of thing. Sandstorms, but not a lot of, actual thunderstorms and things. It's the desert. All right, so let's get back into it. So let's start about these folks and what happens to turn the second intermediate period into the famous New Kingdom, where so many famous pharaohs come out of essentially two families that rule, the 18th dynasty and the 19th dynasty. These are all in the New Kingdom. All right. This period was one where the Egyptians supposedly stopped an invasion so if you read earlier histories, including the Shillington book, which I'm surprised he didn't update this, but for decades, the belief was there was a group called the Hyksos that came from Western Asia, Syria, Palestine region, and they invaded Egypt, took over, set themselves up as pharaohs, and then they were finally defeated by the founders of the 18th dynasty, Akhmos I, etc. New research has shown that that's probably not exactly what happened. It wasn't some large-scale invasion, because people believe that, you know, they amassed themselves in Syria and Palestine, and they used their chariots, because the Egyptians didn't have chariots at the time. The Egyptians didn't even have a standing army at the time. This is one of the things that the New Kingdom is going to change. Middle Kingdom and Old Kingdom Egypt, there's no standing army. Whenever there's a war, people are called up and they fight, and they go back to doing whatever it is that they're doing. So it was believed that the Hyksos, with their standing army, they had the composite bow, so they had better military technology in terms of how they constructed their bows, and they had chariots, which the Egyptians didn't have. They were able to just overrun the Niger Delta, I keep saying Niger Delta, the Nile Delta, and take over and then push their way up the Nile or south and control much of Lower Egypt and even parts of Upper Egypt. New research has suggested that it was a lot more gradual and it shouldn't really be referred to as a quote-unquote invasion. Modern research is saying what happened is you had Western Asians coming into the Nile Delta region as mercenaries. So again, they didn't have a standing army in Egypt, so some local rulers during the beginnings of the intermediate period would rely on Western Asian soldiers for their local battles. So you get more of them starting to come in. They may have came in as workers. They may have came in as other things, just migrants coming into that region. And then eventually the ruling class in the Niger Delta allies with these folks against the central authority of the pharaohs, whose capital was Memphis and operating there. And it's more of a amalgamation of peoples as opposed to just a Hyksos invasion. But eventually the Western Asians get the upper hand in that whole thing, and they're able to effectively control the region. But it's a longer process than just a quote-unquote invasion as was previously understood. Daniel, if you wouldn't mind pulling up that webpage that I give you. This is all still being debated by historians and archaeologists and others. And a lot of work is being done. And currently there's a project called the Hyksos Enigma. The Hyksos Enigma. And they're bringing together all of these scholars to try to figure out the answers to what actually happened. What they're doing, and the reason why I'm highlighting this is for two reasons. One, the Hyksos are incredibly important in terms of historiography. It was believed, and a lot of people get excited when they hear about the Hyksos because, oh, it's a group from Western Palestine that came over into Egypt and then they got pushed out of Egypt. This sounds like the biblical account. Are these the Hebrews? So a lot of people attempted to connect the Hyksos to the story of the Exodus in the biblical account. It doesn't really match up. No historian makes that connection. It's not really a thing. But that's how they became popular, because a lot of people attempted to connect the Hyksos to the biblical narrative. But more importantly, I'm bringing this up because the work that they're doing with the Hyksos is what Jope asked African scholars to do with African history, particularly the history of the Nile Valley. In order to answer this question, here's what they're doing. They're engaging the historiography. So that's R1. These are all different research tracks to figure out the answer. They're using historiography. So everything that's been written about the Hyksos by the Egyptians and others, they're analyzing that. They're using migration studies. So there are people that are specialists in the movement of ancient people. They're bringing in cultural studies. So they're looking at the artifacts that people leave behind and testing them, pottery and artwork. They're using settlement and space studies, multi-directional cultural interference studies, trade and crisis analysis, bioarchaeology of human remains, and bioarchaeology of animal remains. They're bringing all of these specialists together to answer this question. On the ground research in the Nile Delta, in the Eastern Nile Delta, where these people lived and where they established their capital when they took over Egypt. And to answer this question, all this to say, and I'm going to keep talking about this when we talk about ancient Africa, we need African people engaged in all of these studies, doing this type of work. This is what Job wanted us to do. Job did not want us to do this. Job did not want us to go to the library, read a book that was published 20 years ago, and make our conclusions based off of that, and then write and call that, this is African people doing history. That's the most basic form of historical research, is going to the library, reading the books that somebody else wrote, and then writing something based off of that. Job didn't want us to do that. Job wanted us to do this. Go into the Nile Delta. Go to where these remains are. Systematically investigate what they're doing. And I read some of the report from this project. They're taking human skulls, they're analyzing people's teeth to figure out, are these Western Asian people or are these Egyptians? And what's the mixture of the two? And how many people were present? And where are they coming from? What type of animals are being sacrificed and being used? And all using the most advanced scientific techniques to solve this problem. And not just coming from one discipline, but multiple disciplines. This is the type of work that we need to do in Africa, and not leave it into the hands. And everybody that's working on this project, for the most part, is Asian or European. Very few Africans working on this project. I didn't see one. So I won't say that there's none. I just didn't see one. It's all Europeans and a couple of folks from Syria working on this in Africa. So that's an important thing to point out. We need people doing this type of research. But anyway, thank you, Daniel, for pointing that out. Eventually, though, just like with the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, it's folks from the city of Waset, or the city of Thebes, that pushed the Hyksos out of Egypt. So the invasion is kind of a myth. So they didn't really invade. They were kind of there, and they got power over a gradual period of time. But the actual kicking out, now that isn't historical myth. They actually were kicked out, and we can see that through the archaeology. At one point, there was a major city, and it was thriving, and then the archaeological record shows that that city wasn't thriving anymore, which means the Egyptians actually pushed them back into Western Asia, and they didn't stop. They not only pushed them back into Western Asia, they took over parts of Western Asia, all the way up into Syria. We'll get to that in a minute. But this was all attributed to one of the kings of Thebes named Akhmos I, Pharaoh Akhmos I. Akhmos I is given credit for expelling the Hyksos. But the funny thing is, Akhmos I gives the credit to somebody else. His mother, Ahotep, Queen Ahotep, the queen mother Ahotep. She actually ruled Upper Egypt. So these people are coming from Thebes, a city in Upper Egypt, in the south of Egypt. This is the same city that produced the first pharaohs of the 11th dynasty. So whenever Egypt has these internal battles and things are looking like a lot of chaos is happening, it tends to be people from the south that come up to reestablish order. And they're all centered at this city called Waset, that the Greeks call Thebes. It's also the city of the god Amun, or Amun-Ra. So just like Amun-Ra is the god of the Middle Kingdom, Amun-Ra becomes the god of the New Kingdom. He's the major god coming out of the city of Waset. But anyway, she rules because when her, at first, there was another guy named Kamos. So whenever you see Mos or Meses at the end of a name, that means the son of. So the son of Ah. Ah is one of the deities. So Meses. There was one named Meses who ruled before. It was either his brother or his uncle, or we don't know exactly his relationship to Akhmos I, but he ruled, but he died really quick. And Ahotep took over for her son, who was like 5 when he technically became pharaoh, but she ruled for about 20 years as his regent. And then even after he's the pharaoh, she still continues to have a tremendous amount of power. And it's believed that she died at around age 90. She lived a relatively long life, one of those Ramesses II type lives. We'll talk about him a little bit later on. But essentially, Akhmos I says that it was his mother who led many of the military campaigns down the Nile River to expel the Hyksos and their supporters into Western Asia. So much so that she was given a military symbol. This piece of jewelry, these are flies. Flies were known for their aggressiveness and perseverance. So this was a military decoration, a military honor that few people in general were given, but definitely few women were given. And it was given to his mother by her son, Akhmos I. This was in her treasures. We found her tomb. And this is one of her military decorations. So she led the troops in the battle to expel the Hyksos. But the credit is given to her son because he finished the job and expelled the Hyksos. And he is the founder of the 18th dynasty, the founder of the 18th dynasty. But I keep going back to this because we can't forget our queen mothers. We're going to have a whole conversation on queen mothers when we talk about our Shiros and other folks. But she is one of them. She is one of the people that helped reunite Egypt. And her son recognized this, and the other Egyptians recognized this, and she was given great honor throughout her life, and even after she lived. She was celebrated in Egypt as one of the people that expelled the foreigners. Again, they made Egypt great again, if we want to use modern parlance. Because that's how they thought. I mean, it's literally, they thought like that. Like, yeah, they didn't like foreigners, whether it was the people to the west, the Libyans, the Nubians to the south, or the Asians to the east. When I say they, I'm talking about the royal family. That was part of their propaganda that, yeah, we expelled the Hyksos. And this is where kind of that myth of the Hyksos invasion kind of starts. It starts being propagated by the royal family. After they take over, they're like, yes, celebrate us because we freed you from the foreigners. We freed you from, Hyksos literally means the foreign rulers. We freed you from the foreign rulers that attempted to control Egypt. So Akhmos I gets celebrated as the leader that does this. And he establishes the 18th dynasty. So his descendants are some of the most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history, starting with Thutmose I, who was a great ruler. So after he reestablishes order in Egypt, his descendants say, "Why stop there? First we got to take over Nubia again." So a lot of these rulers start to get into battles with Nubia because they believe that Nubia, you allied with the Hyksos, you took advantage of the situation when we were in trouble. So now we're taking over Nubia. So a lot of them do. They have military operations to the south. They have military operations to the west against the Libyans. And then under Thutmose III, it actually starts with Thutmose I, they start taking over Western Asia as well. They start taking over Western Asia, going into Palestine, going into Syria, and taking over land. We're going to look at the map of the Egyptian empire in a minute. One of the most interesting pharaohs during this time was actually Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was a descendant of Akhmos I and was probably the most powerful female pharaoh of all time, because this is the most powerful Egypt is. This is when Egypt is an imperial power. So she's probably, at the time, not probably, she's the most powerful woman in the world at this time. Now, how she becomes pharaoh is really interesting. And there's a lot of Thutmoses involved in this, so I got to slow down and make this make sense. And again, there's a lot of inter-family marriages that happen. This is what royal people do. They want to keep their blood royal, so you got brothers marrying cousins and sisters and all types of stuff. So yeah, that happened. This is what's going on. All right. Her father, Thutmose I, very powerful ruler, strong military leader. Her brother was also her husband, who's Thutmose II. That's her husband / brother. Her stepson / nephew, so it's Thutmose III. He's not her biological son. So even though he's married to his sister, and this is kind of something that historians are still trying to wrestle with, whether these marriages were actual marriages that were consummated or they were just symbolic or whatever. But we know Thutmose II had another wife and had Thutmose III. All right, so a lot of Thutmoses. So she's the daughter of Thutmose I, she's the sister / wife of Thutmose II, and she's the stepmother / aunt to Thutmose III. Tutmosis I dies, Tutmosis II takes over, Tutmosis II dies relatively young. Too young, and when he dies, Tutmosis III is still a child. He can't take over. The same way Akhmos was a child and his mother ruled. Well, it wasn't Tutmosis III's mother because she was a lesser wife. It was Hatshepsut, the daughter of Tutmosis I, that takes over as regent. So essentially, what she's supposed to do, she's supposed to rule up until the time that Tutmosis III is an adult or close to an adult, so that's 16, 17, and can actually rule in his own stead as pharaoh. She didn't see it like that. So she takes over, then when he comes of age, she's still like, nah, you're still not ready to rule. I'm going to rule as pharaoh. And she showed herself as pharaoh. The iconography of Hatshepsut, she often shows herself as a man, not because she wanted to be a man, but the pharaoh was represented as this masculine figure during this time, as this warlord, as this. So she recognized herself in that iconography. She wore a false beard. She even changed her own lineage to say that she actually wasn't the daughter of Tutmosis I, that she was actually the daughter of God, of Amon-Ra. So she was, a miraculous birth. A lot of ancients did that. But she ruled, and she ruled quite well. Enough so that the officials and the military officials allowed her to keep ruling, even though Tutmosis III was of age and should have been able to take over the throne. In order to get him out of the way, she sent him to get military training in the south, near the Nubian border. So that was his job. She said, you get out of the capital. You go down there and learn how to fight. Because your grandfather, my father, Tutmosis I, he was a great military ruler. You need to learn how to fight. Go down there and fight the Nubians. And I'll run things up here. And she did. She is really famous for her building projects. She built this great mortuary temple near Waset, near the city of Thebes, where the family comes from. This is the family's hometown. This is the hometown of the god, major god Amon-Ra. And this is where Amon-Ra's temple is. So think of it as the Vatican. So Waset was a political and spiritual capital of ancient Egypt. So it was Rome and the Vatican together. Exactly how that they're set up. That's how Waset was. So she built this beautiful temple. She led a trading, or she financed and oversaw a trading expedition to the land of Punt, another place that historians are trying to figure out exactly where it is geographically. We know it's in the Horn of Africa. We don't know if it's Somalia. A lot of folks now think it's Eritrea, and it's really interesting how they figured that out. Samples were done of the baboons that were brought back during this expedition. And scientists were able to figure out, well, this population of baboons has DNA similar to this population that lives in Eritrea, so this is probably where the land of Punt is. That's the best argument for where it could be geographically. So yeah, very important pharaoh. And when she finally does die of natural causes, she has children and she's well loved by the officials and both the military and religious officials because she did a good job as pharaoh. It's only after she dies that Tutmosis III is able to take over. And he is not happy with his aunt stepmom. So he does a lot to try to destroy her legacy, destroy her statues, and claim things that she did for himself. And early European historians and archaeologists, when they saw this, they said, see, this is the reaction of the Egyptians, because they were so offended by having a female as their ruler that they reacted like this. And a lot of people believed that for a lot of years until they realized that, well, number one, she's not the first female ruler. There were a number of female pharaohs that existed. We talked about several, and we talked about the veneration of Queen Mother Akhotep. But that's a European viewpoint of how history worked. What it really was jealousy. It was a personal vendetta. It had nothing to do with her being a woman. It was the fact that she ruled when he was eligible to rule, and she wouldn't give up the throne. So he wanted to desecrate her in the afterlife because there was nothing that he could do while she was still alive. She had the support of military officials and other officials so nothing he could do. He had to wait till she died to attempt to erase her legacy. And all of that military training that she insisted that he get, he used it well. Tutmosis III became the most conquering ruler in ancient Egyptian history. He conquered more land than any other pharaoh. He won more battles than any other pharaoh. Really important. And his iconography shows him as the conquering ruler. You see him there holding a multitude of prisoners in one hand. If that part of the wall was still there, you would see him holding up a mace. You could actually see the top of the mace in the very, very top stone that's still there, about to smite all of these foreigners. And you can tell that they're foreigners by how their hair looks and how they're tied up. But he was a conquering pharaoh. He controlled everything you see here. So down into Nubia, into the western desert where the Libyans lived. He controlled Palestine. He controlled all the way up to Assyria. So this is modern day Iraq, all the way up there. This is how powerful he was. This is the height of Egyptian imperialism, the height of Egyptian rule in this region that made Egypt a superpower for the time. And this is where the whole Hyksos kind of thing kind of falls apart for historians to trying to connect the Hyksos to the Hebrews, because it doesn't really make sense. You can't leave Egypt if Egypt end up conquering this area anyway. So where are you exiting to? You're crossing the Red Sea to stay in Egypt. That doesn't even make sense. So that's how that gets kind of dispelled. But anyway, Tutmosis III, very important pharaoh. I'm gonna go a little bit faster just for the sake of time. So he lives, Hatshepsut lives, there's Amenhotep II, Tutmosis IV is another conquering pharaoh. And then we get to the Amenhoteps, particularly Amenhotep III. He is, again, another one of these military pharaohs, establishes and secures the borders. This is Egypt at its height. And then we get to this guy, Amenhotep IV, who throws a monkey wrench in the whole thing. So again, his father was a great military pharaoh. This is all in the 18th. This is all the same family, going all the way back to Queen Akhotep and Akhmosis I. This is all the same family, the 18th dynasty. Amenhotep IV is born. He grows up in the capital, but he has really, really different religious views from other people around him. There is another minor deity that is starting to get some traction, and it's the deity of the Aten, or the sun disk. So the major god is Amun-Ra. But then there's this other cult that's emerging called the cult of the Aten, the sun disk. He becomes essentially the great spokesperson for the Aten. And then when he becomes pharaoh at the death of his father, he starts to gradually make the Aten the new national god. But he changes a number of things in the worship of this god. For the other deities in ancient Egypt, going back to time immemorial, back to the Old Kingdom before, the pharaoh was just one of many religious figures, where you had high priests of this god and high priests of that god, and different temple structures throughout the length and breadth of Egypt. When he comes along, he says, you know what? The Aten is God, and it's only through me that the Aten can be worshipped, through me and my family. So, and the Aten is going to be the only God that's going to be worshipped in Egypt. I'm shutting down everybody else's temple. Hathor, Asar, Aset, and of course, the major god, Amun-Ra. We're shutting down the temple. So imagine, if you will, a Roman emperor saying, we're changing the religion and I'm shutting down the Vatican. So no more Pope, none of this stuff is closed. Everything is going to be to this new religion. That's essentially what he did. Now, if you know anything about the Vatican, you know anything about the Pope, it's a very, very wealthy and powerful institution. So was the Temple of Amun-Ra and the high priest of Amun-Ra. So this caused a lot of controversy. So it wasn't just changing the religion. It was just, okay, everybody went along with it. People were upset because everything they've been practicing for years is now shut down. You can't go into those temples anymore. You have to do everything through the royal family because it's only them that can properly worship the Aten. And this is going to be the god of everybody. So it's the sun disk. So he started a solo theism. A lot of people say we should give him credit for being the founder of monotheism, the first person to say there's only one God. That's technically true. I mean, the Egyptians really believed that there was one God, it was Amun-Ra, and there was these other deities that were underneath Amun-Ra. But he says he's a solo theist. There's no other divinities other than the sun disk, the Aten. And I'm going to change my name from Amenhotep, which means Amen is satisfied. That was the name of his father. That was the name of his grandfather, going all the way back to Aken Aten, the worshiper of the Aten. So he changes his name from Amenhotep. He doesn't want nothing to do with Amen-Ra anymore to Aken Aten. And when he has a son, he names his son Tut-Ankh-Aten. Tut-Ankh-Aten. That's his first name. We're going to talk about him. He's more famous as King Tut. But he changes his name. We'll get to that in a minute. But not only does he change the religion, he starts his own, he builds a new capital city for himself at a place called Armana. And it's there in Armana that he really gets to experiment with a lot of the ideas that he has in this area. He's a very philosophical kind of guy, not a great warrior. And he almost is a derelict in his duties. And one of the pharaoh has to be this great warrior. He was not. He was a pacifist. He didn't believe in a lot of violence. He wasn't interested in really even in politics. He was interested in worshiping his God, his way, and also ushering in a new artistic expression in Egypt. So prior to Akhenaten, we go back to Tutmosis III. This is how the pharaohs were represented. If you look at the statues, if you look at the carvings, the pharaoh is always muscular, ready for battle, bigger than everybody else. The dimensions are kind of pretty much the same. The faces look different to show that these are different people. But for the most part, this is what the pharaoh looks like, going all the way back. Even if we go back to Hatshepsut, you kind of see it's the same general idea of what the pharaoh looks like. By the time we get to Akhenaten, he says, no, I don't want the typical representation of myself as a pharaoh. I want you to sculpt me and draw me as realistically as possible. So you have to imagine the artists, the craftsmen that have been trained and brought up in how to actually draw the pharaoh and represent the pharaoh. They got to change everything. He wants it to be realistic. He said, I'm not in shape. Show me with my skinny arms and my wide hips and my gut. This is what I look like. This is what my wife looks like. This is what we look like. Look at this is who I am. Just draw me like this. When you make busts of my mother, draw her as she actually is. So this is the most realistic time and artistic time in ancient Egyptian history. And it happens very late. We're in the New Kingdom. So this is in the 1300s BCE. So the pyramids were built about 1,200 years before this happened. So this is over 1,000 years after the pyramids. And I want you to understand this timeline, because when we go back to these controversies about who the ancient Egyptians were and what they looked like, this is the late period. This is 1,000 years after the pyramids. And this is what the royal family looked like in the most realistic representations of the royal family. So this is his mother. And he had, his wife, and he would have his family. So again, this is the change. It goes from Amen-Ra, the god of Waset, the god of thieves, the god of gods, the hidden one, to the Aten. And the Aten could only be worshipped by the pharaoh and his family. They were the high priest and high priestess of the Aten. So you had to go through them. And they would draw these images that you never saw before in ancient Egyptian iconography. You never saw the king playing with his children and just having a good time with his wife. That wasn't what was shown. It was always the strong military presence and, never these, the king kissing his kids. Like, no, it never shown like this. You see the royal family worshiping the Aten, making sacrifices to the Aten. And he built this whole new city, the city of Armana, to celebrate his Aten and his god. Well, when he dies, the conspiracy already starts, because there are people, the high priests and others, that have been watching the situation. They couldn't do anything while he was pharaoh, but now they're like, all right, he's dead. We need to bring things back to where they were. So he has a couple of descendants that still follow what he's doing, but his son, Tut-Ankh-Aten, takes over as pharaoh when he becomes of age. Now he's preceded by two people that were close to his father, but when he takes over, the supporters of the god Amen and the way things were before his father took over, they really get in his ear. And they're like, Tukant-Aten, your father was nuts. He messed things up. You need to be the pharaoh to rewrite things, to put things back the way they were. And the first thing you need to do is change your name from Tukant-Aten to Tukant-Aman, or Tutankhamun. And this becomes the famous King Tut. Now, during his lifetime, he's not really that famous. This is the end of the 18th dynasty, excuse me. It's about to be replaced by the 19th dynasty. So there's going to be a change because these people lose legitimacy because of all the nonsense that Akhenaten did. But Tutankhamun serves for a while, and then he dies at a relatively young age. He was in bad health most of his life, and he was buried. And the lucky thing for us as historians, when he was buried, his tomb, I think, was unfinished. So a lot of his stuff was just kind of like thrown in his back room, and then it was kind of shut off. No one knew what was going on with it for a long time. That was until the 19th century or the early 20th century when archaeologists came, they discovered his tomb, opened it up, and it was all these treasures in there. And that's what made him famous, because it was one of the most breathtaking discoveries in early Egyptian archaeology. And we get all the gold and the iconography of him, and he becomes famous, goes on a world tour. So he was much more famous in death than he was in life. Again, you'll see where he's positioned at the end of the 18th dynasty, because after him, there's two more rulers, and then eventually there's a military coup led by a man by the name of Seti. And Seti comes in, and his family is from the north. They're from the Nile Delta region. And these are the Ramesses. So you get Seti the first, and eventually you get to Ramesses the second. Ramesses the second is probably, after, if you ask people to name an Egyptian pharaoh, you might get King Tut first, and you'll usually get Ramesses the second, because people grew up watching the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, and there's Ramesses and Moses and all that. First off, in the biblical account, the pharaoh's not named. We don't have no idea who that pharaoh was from the biblical account, because it just says pharaoh. He's associated with Ramesses because it's believed, and the biblical account has the ancient Egyptians building the city of Pa-Ramesses as one of the tasks that they were done. So people say, well, if they're building Pa-Ramesses, then the pharaoh must be Ramses. Again, and it goes against that whole Hyksos thing, because if that was the case, the Hyksos were spelled hundreds of years before that, so they couldn't possibly be the Hyksos. But anyway, Ramesses II, what we know historically about Ramesses II, a lot of military victories. And he's one of the few pharaohs that ruled for decades. He died when he was in his 90s, and he took over the pharaohship really young. So he ruled for decades, and had a whole lot of kids. He was very prolific in his child making. So he had hundreds of kids, a lot of wives. He ruled, and he loved to display himself in terms of statues, in terms of everything, from the north of Egypt all the way to the south. So from Lower Egypt to Upper Egypt, Ramesses made sure you knew he was pharaoh and that he was in charge. So a ton of building projects, a ton of military victories. This was built right at the border of Nubia. So it was Ramesses showing that, yeah, I'm the man, and I'm going to let the Nubians know that I'm the man. And he built this huge temple with himself and his gods pointing right at Nubia. Again, more images of Ramesses. He was really a prolific builder. Ruled a long time, a lot written about him, and very important king. A couple of decades later, we get Ramesses III. He's not a son of Ramesses II, distant relative. He takes over. And he's kind of the end of this 19th dynasty. So the 18th dynasty ends not long after Tutankhamun. The 19th dynasty comes in with Seti takes over, and then there's Ramesses II. And it kind of ends with Ramesses III. Again, he just takes his name. He's not a direct descendant of Ramesses II. He has a really interesting reign because a lot of bad things happen. First, there's a worker strike. He wants a lot of buildings done. He wants to be like Ramses II. And we know a lot about the actual workers that worked on his projects because what was found in a place called Deir el Medina, a city called Deir el Medina, we found where the workers lived as they worked on his monuments. And what these workers would do, the ones that could write, would write on pottery shards. This was a very common practice in the ancient world. Because when a pot breaks or a vase breaks, you can pick up the shard and you can write on it. Those of you that are old enough to remember this, if you worked in an office, let's say from the 1960s, maybe into the early 2000s, before people really started using email, they would have these things called inter-office communications. You know those you know what I'm talking about? Those yellow things, and you would write and then you scratch off, and then the next person would write and they scratch off. Those back then it was these pottery shards. You pick up a piece of pottery and you write down something and you pass it to somebody and they say, "Oh, okay, I got the message," and they cross up. So we have tons of these pottery shards because pottery, once it breaks, unless you deliberately keep smashing it, it's broke. So it lasts a long time. From these pottery shards and other evidence, we found out about the world's first worker strike. The workers were promised one thing by the government. The government then comes back and says, "We can't pay you this." So the workers say, "Well, we're stopping our work." And they had a spokesperson who went to the Pharaoh's officials and they said, "Look, we're not going to restart the work until you meet our demands. And we want this. And the people were paid in bread and they were paid in beer and other things. That's how people were paid. So they wanted these things that they agreed upon. And they eventually were successful in their strike and they got what they wanted. Really important moment in world history. The first recorded worker strike. So when we talk about the everyday people in Egypt, this is the remains and the artifacts from Deir el Medina really give us a good insight into how these people lived and what they valued and all that. So he had a worker strike happen during his reign, and his reign really ended when he got killed by the women in his harem. There was a conspiracy between some of those women, some other military officials. They didn't see Ramesses III as a particularly effective pharaoh. So they got together and it was this conspiracy. And he actually gets stabbed in his neck. But he doesn't die. So he doesn't die immediately. And he's actually able to live long enough to see the trial. And it happens very quickly. So it's not like the trials today that something happens and months later there's a trial. No, it happens days afterwards. So they want to figure out what happened because it was an unsuccessful coup attempt. I guess the assassination was successful because he does die from his injuries, but it doesn't put in the people that did it because they're all executed. But it comes, the papyrus, that's the court record of what happened during this trial, it actually still exists. You can read it. It was actually near Ottawa a couple of years ago. It was in Gatineau because it travels around the world, this long papyri of this trial record called the Harem Conspiracy, where people are testifying as to what happened and who was involved and why they were trying to kill the pharaoh and what actually happened. So he gets to see the beginning of the trial, but he eventually dies. So he's killed, and then his son takes over. But now there's a lot of trouble in the kingdom, and things are about to go haywire again in Egypt. This is now coming down. Ancient Egypt is coming down to its low point. We are ending the new kingdom. And then eventually we get a takeover. Now, this map is quite interesting because if you look at it, it appears as though nothing was happening in between Carthage and Egypt. So that whole, the modern state of Libya, it appears there was like no people lived there. Did they have a kingdom? Did they have anything going on? Well, we don't know too much about what was happening in Libya other than what the Egyptians say. But at some point, the Libyans get strong enough that they actually take over Egypt. So in essence, today's conversation, we've talked about Egypt being taken over from the east, Asians taking over Egypt. Next week, we'll talk about when Kush takes over Egypt. But at this point, Egypt gets taken over from the west by the hated Libyans. And when they do, they put their own pharaoh in charge. And this pharaoh's name is Shoshonik. This one is, I don't know if the battery, maybe it's the battery. Okay. Yeah. Pharaoh Shoshonik. Shishak, and it's a Libyan name because he's a Libyan pharaoh. He takes over, and this is after the New Kingdom. This is the third intermediate period, the last intermediate period. And we know him from the Egyptian record, but we also know him from the biblical account because he's written about in the Book of Kings. Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shinnuk, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So this is one of Solomon's sons who he was going to kill for some reason. I guess he had rebelled against Solomon, and he ran into Egypt, and he was given shelter by the Libyan pharaoh in Egypt. Now, the biblical account doesn't call him Libyan. They just say, well, he's the pharaoh of Egypt, so he's just Egyptian. But in fact, the Egyptians say this is when the Libyans took over. This is the 22nd dynasty. So folks from the west came over and they took over Egypt. Again, he's mentioned, and it happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam. So he left, fled his father, and I guess he comes back and takes over the kingdom of Israel. That Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the gold shields which Solomon had made. So I guess things don't end up well for Rehoboam. He goes there for shelter, and then when he does take over, the king of Egypt takes him over and takes everything out of the house of the Lord and all of that. So interesting account. Maybe that's why nobody names their kid Rehoboam. I know a lot of people named Solomon. I actually have an ancestor whose name was King Solomon Taylor on my maternal side. A lot of people got named Solomon David. Nobody names their kid Rehoboam. But anyway, all that to say, the biblical account gives us some acknowledgement of the power of the Egyptian pharaohs, even when they're controlled by the Libyans, even when Libyans control Egypt. Next, we'll stop there today. Next week, we're going to talk about when Cush takes over Egypt. When they conquer Egypt, and then when they have their own dynasty, and then we'll talk more about what was going on in Nubia next week. And we'll also talk about that little place up there called Carthage, because both Nubia and Carthage have interactions with the most powerful European kingdom that begins to emerge, which is Rome. And both of them give Rome some of its greatest military defeats. And in fact, when we talk about Carthage next week, Carthage almost took over Rome. You might not even have heard of Rome had some things changed historically. So we'll talk about that next week. We'll stop there today, open up to any questions or comments or